think we have come to the last Analect of book 11. Yeah? Am I right about that? Yeah, it's a nice long one. Pretty good. It's pretty okay. I actually really enjoyed this one. Okay. I'm going to read the Analects, and then on the second page there, I will have Mr. Benji read the commentary, since Esther ducked out of my vision purposefully. Okay, this is 1126. Zilu, Zingxi, Ranshu, and Zihua, I don't know, were seated in attendance. The master said to them, "Because I am older than any of you, no one is willing to employ me. Yet you, too, often complain. No one appreciates me. Well, if someone were to appreciate you, what would you do?" What does appreciate mean in this context? To appreciate your skills, your abilities, what you could offer. So, what would you do with what you have? Zilu spoke immediately. "If I were given charge of a state of 1,000 chariots, even one hemmed in between powerful states suffering from armed invasions and afflicted by famine, before 3 years were up, I could infuse its people with courage and a sense of what is right." The master smiled at him. The master's smile is one of disapproval. This is a side note. Probably of Zilu's abrupt manner, as well as the content of his answer. The disciples that follow are noticeably more cautious in their responses. That's kind of a funny concept, right? Can you kind of, in your mind, imagine his smile? That's funny. Mm-hmm. Then he turned to Ranshu. "You, Ranshu," he said, "what would you do?" Ranshu answered, "If I were given charge of a state 60 or 70 or even 50 or 60 square li in an area, before 3 years were up, I could see that people would have all they needed. As for instructing its people in ritual practice and music, this is a task that would have to await the arrival of a gentleman." The master then turned to Zihua. "You, Zhua, what would you do?" Zhua answered, "I am not saying that I would actually be able to do it, but my wish, at least, would be to learn it. I would like to serve as a minor functionary, properly clad in some ceremonial cap and gown, in ceremonies at the ancestral temple or at diplomatic gatherings." The master then turned to Zingxi. "You, Zingxi, what would you do?" Zingxi stopped strumming his zither, and as the last notes faded away, he set the instrument aside and rose to his feet. "I would choose to do something quite different from any of the other three." "What harm is there in that?" the master said. "We're all just talking about our aspirations." Zengshi then said, "In the 3rd month of spring, once the spring garments have been completed, I should like to assemble a company of 5 or 6 young men and 6 or 7 boys to go bathe in the Yi River and enjoy the breeze upon the rain dance altar, and then return singing to the master's house. According to the commentators, the Yi River was near Confucius' home, and the rain altar was located just above the river. The rain altar was also named because traditionally it was the site where ceremonies were performed to pray for rain during times of summer drought. Although here it seems to be featuring merely as a pleasant destination for an excursion. The master sighed deeply, saying, I am with Zhengxi. The other 3 disciples left, but Master Zheng stayed behind. He asked, what did you think of what the other disciples said? Each of them was simply talking about their aspirations. Then why, Master, did you smile at Zilu? One governs a state by means of ritual. His words failed to express the proper sense of deference, and that is why I smiled at him. Was Ran Chui then not concerned with statecraft? Since when did something 60 or 70 or even 50 or 60 square li in area not constitute a state? Was Zhua then not concerned with statecraft? If ancestral temples and diplomatic gatherings are not the business of the feudal lords, then what are they? If Zhua's aspiration is a minor one, then what would be considered a major one?
The point of this final remark is that Zihua's aspiration also involves high-level diplomacy and statecraft. Despite the surface humility of his response, according to one plausible interpretation of this passage, the master is equally disapproving of Zilu, Ren Chui, and Zihua's aspirations, all of which are overly focused on statecraft techniques, although only Zilu's response is audacious enough to provoke a smile. The point is that true government is effected through the superior virtue gained by ritual practice. And the task of the gentleman is to focus on self-cultivation and attaining a state of joyful harmony with the way. Such wu wei, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Harmony with the way is exemplified by Zhengqi's musical bent. His reluctance to speak about his aspirations and the sense of spontaneous joy in the cultivated life conveyed by his answer. As Li Chong puts it, only Zhengqi has transcendent aspirations. Only he is able to stir up the sounds of virtue and give expression to the master's style and sensibility. His words are pure and remote, his meaning lofty and fitting, and his diligence is certainly something with which one with sagely virtue would feel an affinity. By comparison, the answers of the other 3 disciples seem vulgar. It is interesting to note that the opposition to techniques of statecraft seen here becomes an even more prominent theme in books 12 and 13, and may reflect a growing influence of legalist teachings. Another slightly different interpretation is that the passage is about the importance of timeliness. Although the various aspects of statecraft pursued by the first 3 disciples are important, only Zhengxi perceives that the time is wrong for their application. Mr. Zhao explains that Zhengxi wins approval because he alone understands timeliness. And Huang Kan elaborates, at that time the way was in decline and the world was disordered, and everywhere people were striving against one another, which is why the disciples all had their hearts set on entertaining official service. Only Zhengxi understood the vicissitudes of the age, which is why the master approved of him. Following this line of interpretation, some commentators connect 11:16 with 5.7 and 9:14 and see it as a similar expression of Confucius' frustration with his contemporaries and desire to withdraw from public life.
Wow. What do you guys think?
We were just talking about this one yesterday.
Were you?
With you. You
Oh,
brought it up.
was I?
Yeah.
Okay. Must have been on my mind.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm. Did the description of their time together make sense? This one was fairly straightforward. So there was a lot of excuse me, a lot going on in terms of the it was described later here that just the turmoil that was going on in the country, a lot of disagreement in states and war. Interestingly, in this country, the history of what was in essence fought over. Noah and I were talking about this the other day a little bit. It was more. It was less about taking land and resource, and more about philosophical influence. So it was about it was literally almost always a culture war. And you can see that in how Confucius refers to previous ruling families and the way that they operated, the way that they made decisions for the country as leaders of the country, or over large and small groups of peoples and areas. And so this is in this state of unrest. That's the beginning of this conversation, as Confucius is saying, I'm too old for anybody to want to make use of me, but you guys are saying that no one appreciates you. So if someone did want to make use of you, then what do you think that would be like? What would you want to do? And obviously this wasn't some sort of plan to take over and do something. It was another way that he was going to see and have some insight into the way that they think about themselves, about their placement in the time and among the people that they would be with, and how they would go about living out what they understood to be the way. What's really fascinating about this, and then we'll come right back to this, is that once Confucius passed away, he had a certain set of disciples, I think 70 disciples or something like that, somewhere around that in total. And, there was the compilation of many of these discussions, and to be what they have become in different versions today. There's a very similar process that took place with the scriptures of the Torah, and then later with the the writings in that it is in that there were those who were the recipients of certain wisdom and truth, and then those things were disseminated or passed down by a certain means of writing or word of mouth, and then they were kept record in certain ways. So that happened a couple of major times, and that's what makes up the testaments in the scriptures. But there was 2 or 3 major times. So one very obvious one was this is for the scriptures, when the law was dispensed to Moses. There was a written account and record that was made, and that is the guiding light and writings of Judaism. They follow the Torah, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. So that the account of creation, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were the Pentateuch. They made up the law. And then came, the historical writings, which were, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles. Those were basically the chronicles of the lives of the kings. So there was a lot of history about the development of the nation that was there. And then you have the prophets, and those were added to the primary, which was always the law. I mention it this way because there was a similar process that took place at a later time when these very source level ideas and conversations about the right way of life, what has been described as the mean, the rite of passage, the ritual, those things are not just these Eastern mystical words. They were given to be used as a way of direction for a people, to basically show them how to think and how to treat one another. So interestingly, after this passed, there was a lot of argument over the authorship and when and who wrote, who compiled, who put together the Analects and some of these wisdom writings. And it's very likely that it wasn't Confucius himself, and that it was also not even his disciples, but it was the disciples of his disciples that ended up compiling the writings. So you can see this process of how things were laid down. And then from there became all of these schools of thought as to what they meant. And so it's just so uncannily the same as what we've seen happen with Christianity. So with Christianity, you had the law, the prophets, and the Psalms of David, and the wisdom writings of Song of Solomon. That basically makes up the entire Old Testament. And then, of course, you have the Gospels, which were the first-hand testimony of the life of Jesus Christ, given from several perspectives of his immediate disciples. And then you have the epistles, the writings of Paul, and then Revelation. And so there were a couple of other epistles, one by Peter, another by James, and then was that it? I think that was it for the epistles. It was just Paul, Peter, and James. And John. 1st and 2nd John. So anyway. So you had the first connection of disciples similarly. And then you had a next generation of disciples. And each of those began to take their own meaning. The reason I'm sharing this is because it's a very interesting first-hand look at some of Confucius' first generation of disciples and how they received who he was and the way he thought and what he was trying to engage with them, what he was trying to impart to them. I think that's particularly poignant in this moment of our time because we have someone who has given of himself not as a sage, but as one who had wisdom of life and truth to pass on to others. and it needs to be very carefully handled. That we, you can see clearly through the responses of these several disciples that only one potentially has caught some of the essence of what Confucius has found to be the essence of the mean. And it's not just about the right time to share or whether or not to have an aspiration. It's how those things play out in the way that we live our life. And those all come together to provide a picture of something related to wisdom. So that's an interesting conversation that this whoever he is, Master Zheng, has with Confucius after the disciples leave. And it's evident that after that first generation of disciples, there was kind of a dispersion of understanding in relation to what the real message was. And that actually was prior, and then even further became in the later developing years of the nation of China and that the various empires there. Those wars, in essence, were wars over, and sometimes just different understandings of the same potentially basic principles of wisdom. This is kind of an interesting illustration, but some of us we've watched the series Eat Men. Mm-hmm. Who all has seen that? Anybody? I know
Just
mine.
us.
What's that? Just us?
Maybe Andy.
Yeah, me and Emma watched it.
Yeah.
Oh, Emma. All right. But anyway, there's something that you notice in every single one of those is you have these schools of kung fu that are always competing with one another. Well, those schools are made up of an ideology. So there's that's almost like a projection of the battles that happen between these schools of thought. Because those were called schools. Schools of kung fu. So they had a different philosophy. And obviously through those movies, they're trying to capture whoever the script writer is and storyteller of that man, which Ip Man was a real man, and he did have students and whatever else, but they're trying to. I even had some conversation with Emmanuel about those movies, and he was talking about how they over exaggerate and beautify a certain aspect of Chinese culture to make Chinese culture look really beautiful. But there's a deeper message there, obviously, than simply making a certain nation look good. The underlying principles there were tied and rooted into what the true nature of a gentleman is, and how they live their life. So yes, there are things that are expressed in different ways in that movie, but it was interesting to see how the same kind of battle is going on all over the world. Most of even the things that we see going on in the world right now are not about. There is very much the selfishness of man and the power of resource and control over property and people. But it comes down to the ruling over the hearts and minds of people. And, that's why some of the things that are put out there to be presented to be as ugly as they are, some of the Middle Eastern groups, like I don't know what even some of them can't remember what they call
or
ISIS or whatever. I think
ISIS.
ISIS means like no Western education. That's what that term means. And you see countries like North Korea that are cut off, and China's been very closed to the influences, and that's they even resisted any input from any other nation. They don't want any education form coming in, and that was all part of the history of this nation that has a really well recorded long history of their struggles as a people. and the struggles that they, what they have battled with internally. So that's where a lot of these, that's why in this writing toward the end, we see Confucius, becoming, in a sense, kind of tired of the struggle and frustrated with it, because they're seeing a decline. There's a derailing or a moving away from some of those fundamental things and how they affect the way that even young potential leaders like his disciples would make decisions in life and think of themselves as to who they were, has in many ways, separated itself from the true essence and meaning of that. Anyway, there's a lot of history that surrounds these things, but what do you think is the essence? What are you guys gleaning as the essence of what is learned here or can be seen through the aspirations of these young disciples, as well as what the perspective of the master is, and then what is the mean? What's the true mean in this?
I think when looking, to attain or to become one with the way, as we're seeing Confucius, questioning these disciples, I think one of the biggest differences that I can observe here is how each disciple, apart from Zhengxi, kind of has this view of bringing, or like the way is something that needs to be brought into the world in its kind of harsh state. And Zhengxi is, I think he realizes the way isn't really concerned with the state of the world. Like, that's not the primary focus, is to, I don't think it really even can be brought in a way. It's separate and probably will be seen by the world as separate from what's going on in the world. So that's why, his focus is on the simple and mundane fellowship with brothers and other people that he, cherishes. And so the way isn't really something that's brought into, or like it's not concerned with whatever is happening in the world. It's kind of like what I'm seeing. I don't know if that applies, but
I mean, I see the difference that stands out to me as I think they mentioned it in the commentary stuff, is like all the other three are very focused on how to approach their role as being used. Like, he asks, if somebody came along and put you into a place of being used, what would you do? And it's like the three guys are like, oh, okay, well, that's the question, so this is the answer of how would I be used in that. And then I think it also mentions like the third or the fourth guy is like passing by all of that and almost like realizing that the question is almost like a trick question. It's like Confucius is saying to I'm useless, and you're feeling like you're not being appreciated. It's almost like they're missing the fact that Confucius is bringing up a point about how they consider him, even their own teacher. I don't know. The fourth guy seems like he just passes by the question because it's not about that. That's not what he's asking about, or that's not what he's trying to bring up in his students.
He actually indicates that his answer was the best answer because of a different, a completely different way of thinking about how your life is to be lived. what's useful. So something that was more rooted in the way and how it in what's described as the Wu Wei way
Mm-hmm.
is that there's a perfect balance of again, a leader is not a leader because they try to be a leader or because they force or they can enforce or as Benji was saying, impose upon others their way of thinking or their preference or way of rule. It's something that comes as a more natural outflowing of the life that is within them. And he's saying, and that's what's more representative of the way that the last disciple answers, is that it's not through, like some recreation thing that we do it in simply being lighthearted.
Mm-hmm.
It's in what's more of just an outward expression, a from what's within, way of living life, enjoying certain aspects of life, people, relationships, and certain times.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the timeliness nature of that too. There is a time for all things under the sun, like Solomon said. And so there's a time that's appropriate for, rule and impartation of and giving direction, and there's a time where you fellowship, and to know how to walk appropriately, and even to have an awareness and recognition of when those times are is an indicator of a different type of connection from within and the source of life that you have. Otherwise, you're always moving with, like Zulu, okay, that's what I'm gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Zulu. That was Zulu every time, to his death, and whether that made him a good disciple or a bad disciple, we can determine independently. But it really exposed a way of thinking in a person. And so, the nature of the question was specifically to draw out the aspirations. What are the truest aspirations, and are those worthy? So, and obviously some were smileable. Noah, any put on your part?
This is one of my favorite ones. It definitely shows the true nature of the mean. I think of a fable that can be used to better illustrate this Analect. The master and these disciples are gathered together in front of a target, and they're going to present their skill in archery to the master. And Zulu shoots first, and it knocks. They don't even really see where it hits the target because it knocks the whole thing over. And the next Ranchu shoots, and it's slightly under. And then Jihua shoots, and it's slightly over. And then right at that moment, a great breeze stirs and causes the brush and the trees around them to swirl a little bit, and it becomes evident that there's a giant pear hanging over the master and their disciples. And that's when Xingxi picks up his bow and arrow and shoots the pear. And it falls into his hands, and he and his master share it together.
Pretty epic.
Yeah.
And so what happens is it becomes evident that it's not about hitting the mark, it's about being a true archer.
Mm.
Because a true archer knows what the mark is.
There you go. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's knowing the mean.
Yeah. Do you have a reference for that fable?
No.
You made the fable up?
Yeah.
Oh, I like it. Because there were similar instances recorded about shooting over, shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm glad we had it recorded. Now we have a new fable. But continue, please. I really appreciate that. Very, very insightful.
I just think that walking in the mean is not a it is a matter of practice, but it's one that forms an intuition, which in this context is known as wu wei. It's doing, not doing. It's something that one does not do with when it is truly achieved with conscious effort. Which is not to say that one's heart is no longer in it, but that one's heart is the only thing in it. The mind is no
As opposed to
longer,
the mind.
right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have much more to show though.
Can you elaborate just for context a little on the wu wei?
That's a pretty important one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm tempted to say that there's a lot to it, but there's really nothing to it. So.
I know. There's a lot that you can say about it, but I mean, just conceptually, is everyone? I think that it might be helpful
A more
to give at least a basic understanding
like
of
Western
what it is.
interpretation of wu wei is getting what's called into the flow. So there's actually an official term known as the flow state. So this is more like a physical, mental interpretation of what wu wei could be, but it has much more to do with just the body and just the mind. It goes beyond those categories. But you guys all know what a flow state is, right? That's something that an athlete may get in, for instance, when they're performing without any overthinking at all, surely, but also they basically reach this pinnacle of their ability to perform whatever they have practiced in, to where in some cases it almost seems inhuman because they don't consciously try to get to that state of performance, but they reach it in a very natural and effortless way, and they remain in it. And sometimes they're not in it, sometimes they're out of it, in which case their performance may not be as smooth or as skilled. I think the general sentiment though of being in the flow is something everyone's pretty familiar with though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just imagine that, but it being life. That's what wu wei is.
This sounds so goofy. You guys can laugh at me because I was a goofy little kid like this, but I could get, and you were referring to athlete. I could get in that mode, especially in a sprint, and I didn't really have it's not control, but it's like an inner control of something that supersedes what seems to supersede the ability of the body. So like soccer. Oh, I played a lot of soccer and basketball, but basketball's a pretty short court. There's not a long sprint in basketball, but there's a soccer field is like 100 yards. And I played the sweeper position. And so, like, the sweeper covers literally from goal to goal, because it's primarily a defensive position. And basically, the sweeper, they call it the sweeper because you clean up. If the offense of the opposing team gets through, then it's basically you're the last stop before the goalie, who only protects the goal. And so the sweeper doesn't have a single position on the field. He plays defense all the way to the point that offense can be played. So a sweeper, in essence, from a team standpoint, has permission to be anywhere on the field at any time that they're needed, primarily in a defensive posture, but also when if in his defensive posture he's able to retrieve or recover control of the ball, then he can take that to the offense and not even be responsible necessarily to have to even kick it off to a forward position so that they can try and score. Anyway, that's the way that position works. Needless to say, it's an extremely tiring position because you can run 200 yards in a very short period of time. In that you may run all the way up on a turn of defense on the back and move all the way to the front, only to have to sprint back very quickly to be back on the low side of the defense. So we did a lot of practice running and sprinting those stretches. And probably my junior year, I realized that I was maybe the fastest person in my class. And that's neither here nor there. We were a small school, so I probably wasn't really that fast. But I can remember on certain sprint exercises, you've heard the phrase maybe, turn on the jets. Mm-hmm. But I could literally do that. I could be sprinting I could like totally do a like an Arwen on the horse kind of thing and like be like I could feel that happen inside my body. And it was like, but yeah, like it's weird. I'm just trying to describe an experience, not a capability. There's something inside you that you get into how something works, and you can you let yourself go into it, and all of a sudden there's this it's unstoppable, and it's not something that is like, I don't know, it's not like your own thing. And again, that's just illustrative of obviously there's a correlation here to the flow and the power of God through the flow of the Spirit and the life of the Spirit. It's not you, but it's not without you. It's with you in that sense. And so there is this, and Noah, correct me if I'm wrong for sure, but there's kind of an indirect reference to that kind of flow of life that it's not something that you're like, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it in this way, A, B, C, D, and you have that there's some format of practice that you're going to do to be able to accomplish that. I can hear and see through my observation the arguments of people. Music's not any different, okay? And I love the reference to music here, because I've seen a lot of people who can do, and I've given this illustration before, but I've seen a lot of people who can play an instrument very well. They're perfectly on time. They never miss a single stroke. They never miss one note. It's perfect, but it doesn't sound right. And then there are those who get into this flow, and somehow the timing changes. It's still perfect, but it's like extenuated. It's beyond perfection. It hits the right. It's again the timeliness. There's perfection in its timeliness, because And it's not through a specific way of training or practice. It's more through becoming one with the flow of what the expression of that musical piece is. And that's not just, that is a talent, but it's more than a talent. It's something that like comes as an expression from what's within. And you connect to something that's beyond yourself. And so it makes you more than what you can be. And it also is something that you don't have to impose on yourself or on others. And that kind of flow, it's irresistible. And that's, in essence, the kind of leadership that is laid out at the very fundamental level of this way of life and what it has as a potential with others, in the midst of mankind. Because there's a natural, you want to receive from whatever that flow is.
I would mention, just to pique
Yeah.
your interest, everything that we're discussing, this strain of thought is basically everything that Taoism was originally about. With teachers like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, this is the central point of the discussion there. Just reminded me of our conversation the other day.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the way is.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually even beyond an individual person's way, or course as it's also called. But it's a very way of understanding reality to Taoists, at least.
I'm intrigued by it. Taoism is something that in Christianity you grow up and you're like, you don't want to hear any of those Eastern words and all the things that they mean and refer to. And I am not, Noah's not, Emmanuel never did promote Eastern religion. That was never the case.
The reason it's weird right now is because it's strongly affiliated with Buddhism, because they basically became one down the road.
Yeah,
but not originally.
and that's, I'm glad you referred to that, because that was, in essence, we have the degradation and the dissolution or the, what do you call the watering down?
Diluting.
You said there earlier.
Yes, diluting.
Dissolution is good too.
Yeah, of the purity and the pure essence of something. The more that it is poured into something that is not fully given to it, it becomes dispersed in it. And so it's a less pure form and understanding and expression of that. And then when that happens again, it doesn't take very many generations for there only to be remnants of what is true there. What's fascinating to me now is that, when these were originally just considered to be conversations, that accounts were made of these conversations, and there was a lot of weight to them, but they became very diluted over a period of time through an improper way of discipling. That's not untrue Christianity. And what's very intriguing to me about that type of process and even where this kind of very basic wisdom came from is set in a series of timelines. Because God, if we look at the true essence of the law was not just commands to do certain things and not to do others, just as we have learned here. It's not about whether you do one thing or another, it's how you go about doing it. And so the essence of the law of Moses was not about whether a people were capable of following the rules or not. Clearly, they were not. And the latter scriptures indicate that as well. In fact, Moses indicated before he even died, saying that he already knew, God had already shown him that the people would rebel against the law. But it wasn't, their rebellion was not directly, we're not going to follow these rules. It was, the law is representative. The law is, guys, I'm just telling you, if you will reread the law and not be so bored with, if you're working in your field and your donkey goes buck wild and the hoe hits your neighbor's horse and kills it, then here's how to make reparations for that. Well, to me, that sounds like an Analect. What would you do in this situation? How would this be handled? And the law gave guidance for all of those things. So what was it really pointing at? The situations? Because remember, in just a couple of Analects before, the same question was asked of two different disciples and two different answers were given. So which one was right? Well, Confucius says, well, that depends on the person. Depends on how they're going to work that out. And that I'm not giving that type of leniency to the law in terms of what is right and wrong, or the moral standard of the law. But the question is, what was this moral standard supposed to produce, not just in an individual, but in a people and in a nation? And that was wisdom. And that's the very thing that Moses describes about the law. He says, this body of laws, this body of commandments given to us will make us to be a nation of a wise people. There's no other people that were given this body of laws by their God. No one. So here's what's fascinating about that. You have the law of Moses given. You have the people struggling with that. They don't know how to put it into practice. Okay? They're just all over the place. And then without anyone to lead them in that way. Moses had said, and God had told Moses, it was prophesied another prophet like me would be raised up to be able to show you this way. So the law was a living way, okay, but they couldn't live it. They could not in their own ability meet its standard. They never could find the mean in the law. That's the spirit of the law. It was never practiced, and it was surely never passed on because it was never taught in that way. It was given, it was true, and it was perfect. David said so. So David was someone who came along, and this is what pleased God so much about David. Because look at David's life. He didn't do everything right, and he didn't do everything wrong. He was all over the place. But what did God say about David? He's a man after my own heart. And if you read the Psalms and you see the life experiences of David and you can see them from his standpoint, and from his place, in his shoes, then you find someone who was really looking for the mean in the law, who meditated with the fundamental truth settlement that this is perfect. There's nothing wrong with this. So how do I discover its true essence? And what is there in me that is hindering me from understanding the meaning of the law? And God thought that was such a beautiful thing in one. So you have this one, and then he bears a son who is fully representative of wisdom because it was the very thing he asked for of God. And God gives him to be wise among all the nations of the earth. And his kingdom was so great, and his wisdom was of such renown, that the rulers of the world came from all over the world to see his kingdom. But not just to examine his treasuries, to swim in his gold, to look at his large herds of horses, but to understand, to attempt to understand his wisdom. That was the real treasure. Now the kingdom of David and Solomon was only 300 or 400 years prior to the life of Confucius. And what happened between the kingdom of David and Solomon and the time and life of Confucius actually was the full degradation of the kingdom of Israel. It was broken up and parsed down, and whatever purity and essence was there, exemplified through David and his son Solomon, had been diluted and broken into pieces and became like it was nothing until the treasuries which is not just treasure like gold and silver. That is all of the literature, the writings, the understandings, the conversations, the chronicles of the kings, all of those things were taken through the exile. The first king, the first empire, Nebuchadnezzar, took all of those things. Where did they go? Into his, but see, this dispersion took place. And I would, this is completely 100% conjecture, by the way, but the timing is really interesting. That it is somewhat likely that the renown of the king of Israel as an appointed one of God, and the wisdom that was given to his son Solomon being globally renowned, probably made its way into other countries, so that there was a deep consideration of what a righteous kingdom was and how it would be ruled. So then Jesus comes along later on, as that was prophesied. He is the prophet. He's announced as this one, and then he presents this way of life, and he calls himself, in essence, the embodiment of God's wisdom, which is not about a bunch of knowledge. It's about the way that he lived his life. He takes on disciples. Jesus lays down his life. He is raised again, and he's appointed to govern over this way in the midst of a people that is given its power and life through the Spirit. And then what, perchance, is this? What is this called specifically in the book of Acts? What is Christianity called? It's not called Christianity. It's called what? The way. Isn't that fascinating? That kind of blows my mind a little bit. Because there is a core essence here that is truly rooted in something that predated all of this, and that being the dispensation of the law to Moses. And there were other peoples who seriously thought more seriously about the law than the people that it was given to, which was also prophesied that would happen. That it would be, that understanding would be given to a people of strange tongue and foreign nations, because they applied more diligence to try and seek out, what we might be able to call the meaning in a similar way that David did. So this is not about pointing out specific nations as having had the truth. Noah's reiterated to me many times that Confucius did not have any religious bent or preference or anything like that. He was more about how this worked out practically in relationships in life. And this is a great example of his sentiment along that line. But it is the very essence of at what level in us does this life and the potential of this life flow. Isn't it interesting that Noah would mention a flow? Someone prayed this morning about the Rachel prayed about the flow coming out, or Kim maybe. Anyway, that out of our mouths would flow the rivers of water. That's that spring of life within. That's the same message that Jesus shared with the woman at the well, and that he preached to others, was about this flow of life. And that's, it's being referred to through these Analects. There's a deeper flow of wisdom. And, of course, what I really want to be intentional about is for us to be able to see this is, it really connects back to the essence of the life flow of God as the true source of all things. And so, anyway, Noah, anything to add along that line? Felt like I babbled a little bit at the end there, but... Anyone else have some thoughts? Okay, everybody's being quiet. Well, we will continue on into book 12. Elijah, will you close us in prayer?
We bless your holy name, Father. Lord, I thank you for wisdom given to us, Lord, from you. Lord, the wisdom that you always wanted your people to have, Lord, to share with you in a relationship, Father. Lord, I pray that as we learn about people who were able to have an understanding of this way, Lord, that we would see it as something that is still living today, or something that can still be learned from, still be practiced. Lord, that we would not put restrictions on our own minds or to your work, to what you can do, Lord. And that our minds would be willing to continually learn, and our hearts would desire to be closer to yours. Praise your name. Amen.
Amen.